right. Well, for the last the last few weeks, I've been talking to you all about the new framework that's coming out with MVC4, the ASP.NET Web API. I talked a little bit earlier about basics of the framework, some of the features it has, and more importantly, why the framework is being introduced, and that is to support HTTP-based services in the Microsoft stack. Last week, we dug a little bit deeper, and we looked how to create a simple service and how to call that service. And we even looked at some of the content negotiation capabilities. Today, I'd like to continue the discussion to talk a little bit about clients. So what do I mean by client? What is a client? Well, a client is really anything that wants to interact with our services. It could be a mobile app. It could be a web browser. It could be a tablet. It could be a camera. Could be a watch, or even a home automation system. So what I'd like to demonstrate for you today is how clients interact with our services. And the first demonstration I want to give you, we'll talk about how we can use JavaScript to interact with our clients. We'll use Jquery to call our services using Ajax. When our service responds, we'll use Jquery's templating abilities to render our views. And on a side note, I just want to mention that the majority of, and we'll present our views. On a side note, I want to mention that the majority of the examples from here on out are going to be working with a fictional pitbull adoption website that I put together called Pity Love. When I showed this to my wife, she mentioned I should show the image because you may think I'm talking about armpits when I mention it. So there's a screenshot of that. So the rest of the examples will be using this fictional pitbull adoption site. The idea is to make our examples just a little bit more relevant. And plus, pit bulls are pretty awesome. If you know me, I'm a dog person, and I have two of the little guys at home. So let's take a look at our first example using JavaScript clients with the ASP.NET Web API. So I'm going to quickly go into Visual Studio here. And the first thing I want to mention briefly about this solution is that we have a model project. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but I need to mention it just for the sake of the example. This is really our data access tier. I have a simple entity framework, an entity model here with a single entity called Pitbull. And our Pitbull objects have IDs, names, descriptions, and image URLs. Another thing to mention about this particular project is that we have a repository pattern and a unit of work pattern. Again, if you're not familiar with these patterns, it doesn't matter much. It's just that I'm going to be referencing these objects in the next example. So just know that this is how we actually access the data in our database. So on to our first example of JavaScript clients. The first thing I want to look at is our Web API service. And we looked at a little bit of this last week. Our service is named Pitbull Controller. And we know from last week that this is a Web API service because it derives from the new base class, the API controller. A couple of interesting things about this particular service is that our constructor is injected with the unit of work. The unit of work is one of the objects from the model project that will allow us to access our data. And so when this object is constructed, I'm using dependency injection just to give me basically an instance of the unit of work so I can make database queries. The only other thing in this service is a GET action. One interesting thing about this particular action is that we're actually returning an HTTP response message. Now, if you paid attention to the code examples last week, I was returning an IEnumerable or a list. And either will work just fine, but by using this HTTP response message, we get a little bit more granular control of the response that's sent back to the client. We can set things like the status code, and we can control the exact content that was actually pushed back to the client. Other than that, there's not really a whole lot interesting going on in this controller. You can see I'm using the unit of work here to get a list of the pitbulls from the database. So this will return to me all the pitbull records in the database in the form of entities. Then I'm asking the request object to create for me an HTTP response message. And I'm passing an OK status code, so that's an HTTP 200 that will go in response. And the content will be the list of pitbulls that I just queried from the database. So this is our service, doesn't do much, gets a list of pitbulls from the database, returns them to the caller. And our caller in this case, since we're talking about JavaScript clients, is our index page here. And I mentioned in the introduction that we'll be using Jquery's templating ability. And so the first thing of any consequence really in this view is this Jquery template. Now, if you're not familiar with Jquery templating, all it really is a way to describe a way an object is represented in HTML. So for every pitbull that's returned to our service, Jquery will render an individual div displaying the image URL, the name, and the description. At the bottom of this file, we actually see where our JavaScript call happens to our service. We're using the Jquery getJSON call, and the end result of this call is an HTTP request sent to our service using Ajax. So this is going to call our pitbull service, and it's going to call our get method, which I just showed here previously. When this method returns, the list of pitbulls comes back from the service, and we use Jquery's template engine to render the template, and we should see a list of all of our docs. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit F5 and run this so you can see execute. And the first thing we should notice here is that we're going to hit our breakpoint in our Web API get action, and this is actually the Jquery Ajax request coming in. So we'll step through this. I'm using the unit of work to get the list of our pitbulls. We look here, we should have 3 of them. And then I'm going to basically ask the request object to stream back our HTTP response message. So go ahead and let this run. And there we go, our list of pitbulls. We have Olive, Jaboom, and Oscar. All very cute dogs and actually adoptable. These images all come from a website called Bad Rap, which is a California-based pitbull rescue. So I just want to walk through this code one more time briefly because there's a little bit of stuff going on here that I want to make sure is clear. We really only have 3 things happening. We have a Web API service, which has a get action that's returning a list of dogs. We have a Jquery template, which renders our dogs, renders the markup for our dogs. And we, of course, have our Jquery call, which calls our service to get the data. And then the end result is our list of dogs. So when you think about it, all the stuff that's happening here, the Jquery library is pretty powerful, and using JavaScript to call our service is pretty clean. We really only had 3 things. We had the service, the template, and the Ajax call. So it works out pretty nice. It gives us the snappy kind of Web 2.0 deal. It's very responsive to the user. But what if you can't rely on JavaScript? As an example, what if you wanted to call a service that was hosted on Google's API? Well, that service resides in Google's domain, and since client-side libraries like JavaScript can't make cross-domain calls, you can't really rely on JavaScript to interact with that service. So to get around that particular problem, the Web API gives us a new class with the MVC4 drop called the HTTP client. And the HTTP client gives us a way through C# to interact with the HTTP service in a really nice type-safe sort of way. So the last example I want to show you today is how we can use this HTTP client to interact with our services in cases where JavaScript isn't really a viable option. So let me go back to Visual Studio here. And I have a second example. Let's set it as the startup project. All right, the first thing I want to point out is that the service in this case is exactly the same. We're not doing anything differently. I'm getting a list of pitbulls, and I'm returning them to the caller. If we look at the view, however, it's quite a bit different in this case. You'll notice that there's no JavaScript anywhere to be found. If you're familiar with MVC, this is about a standard of a Razor page that you can actually have. I'm stating that the model is to be a list of pitbulls, and below we have a simple for each loop that will iterate for each item in the collection, rendering essentially the same div that our Jquery template was rendering. Again, we have the image URL, we have the name, and we have the description. So we have our service and we have our view, but I haven't showed you where we're actually interacting with the service as of yet. So where we do that in this particular case is in the action of our view. When that index view is requested from the browser, standard MVC is going to invoke this index action. And in here is where we can actually make the service call. So if we just look through this code briefly, I'm creating an empty list of pitbulls that I'm eventually going to return to the client. I'm creating a new instance of the HTTP client class, which is new with the ASP.NET Web API. This will allow us to actually call our service from the C# code. I'm naming it proxy. Here I'm asking the proxy to create for me a task that will essentially call this pitbull service. When that task is complete, I ask it to continue to read the response. And when it reads the response, I want it to try to coerce the JSON that comes back to the service into a type that satisfies this type, which is a list of pitbulls. And at the end of all this, I actually have a list of pitbulls that is our CLR type, it's our entity type. And so the interesting thing about this is we actually made a service request that returned JSON. Our service is returning JSON in this case. And by using this HTTP client, it actually coerces it into types. So no longer do we actually have to work with the JSON within our controllers, which is a pretty messy thing. A lot of times we have to use open source frameworks that we're not really sure about to do that, or we're doing string parsing logic ourselves. So this is a really nice addition that we've gotten with the new framework. So at the end of this, I have a list of pitbulls, and just like any normal MVC view, I'm giving the view the model, and the Razor view engine is going to build up our view and display to the user. So if we go ahead and run this one, here's our index action, and I'm just going to step through this. I'm creating the empty list. Now this particular line of code is going to call our service, so we should actually end up in our pitbull controller service here. And there we go. I'm going to query the database, get the list of pitbulls. I'm going to create the response and stream it back to the client. And again, we have our same list of pitbulls. Now the difference between this example and the first example is that one uses JavaScript and completely client-side, and this example used the new HTTP client, which is a server-side request. Now there are cases a lot of people don't like working with JavaScript. They prefer working in a type-safe environment, so they'll use this method. And there's cases where you'll have to use this method, but the case that I suggested with calling your service outside of your domain. All right, so just to wrap up what we kind of talked about in the section on clients, I covered some of the various clients, whether it be a phone or a browser or a tablet. I talked a little bit about how you can use JavaScript and Jquery to interact with our services, and we looked a little bit at the new class that was given to us with MVC4, the HTTP client. Again, if you want more, I published the link again, and I want to say one more time, this is a great link. It's got tons of examples. It is, in my opinion, the best technology site that Microsoft has put out about one of their technologies. So definitely take a look at that. Or better yet, if you want to hear me talk more about it, come a week from next Thursday to MDC, and we'll gladly tell you more. With that, I'll turn the meeting over to our Toastmaster for today, Alex.